Welcome, and thanks for attending our talk today. It's great to be with you. We are very excited to talk about a topic that applies to each and every one of us as human beings, and we're hoping that this helps you avoid some of the pitfalls inherent to cybersecurity. My name is Josiah Dykstra. I'm a technical fellow at the National Security Agency in the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. This is where NSA intersects with the private sector to help prevent and mitigate threats against the Department of Defense, national security systems, and the defense industrial base. NSA is always trying to do our job the best that we can, and with the appropriate resources. That's why I'm here today. My PhD and all of my experience is technical. I have spent 17 years in this field as a researcher and practitioner, but I learned in the last couple of years that this intersection between people and technology are very interesting and really important challenges. So I love that intersection. Doug?
Hi, my name is Doug Hough. I'm a faculty member at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm an economist. I'm a behavioral economist, which means that I do not assume that everyone is rational at all times. And I usually write and talk about irrationality in healthcare. But working with Josiah, we were able to talk about and think about and now present about how some of the concepts in behavioral economics and behavioral psychology can apply to cybersecurity.
So let me give you an overview of our talk. I'm going to start by describing traditional cybersecurity goals, the things that we think about today. And then I'm going to hand it over to Doug to introduce bias, cognitive bias, generally, and also action bias specifically. I'll come back and describe how I see action bias manifest in cybersecurity, why it's a problem, and also give a bunch of countermeasures. What can we do about this if it's indeed a problem, like we'd say? So having worked in this field for 17 years, I think I would share in common with you a general definition for what is cybersecurity. What are our goals? And usually it's something like we want to prevent and mitigate harm. We all kind of agree on that. And in that sense, we have this thou shalt not pass mentality, right? Keep the bad attackers out and let legitimate users do whatever their primary goals are. But if we scratch beneath the surface a little bit, I think we'll see differences in these traditional goals. And I want you to think about three groups of people: users, cybersecurity defenders, and senior leaders. So a user wants to achieve her or his primary goal: being able to purchase things online, being able to manage finances with their bank, being able to communicate with friends and family. And so they see those gains much more than they feel the losses. They think security gets in the way, and so their real primary goal is that primary task. Those of us who are cyber defenders, on the other hand, our goal often is to fight fires. Whenever an incident occurs, it's our job to clean up after that incident and hopefully to help prevent similar things from happening again. But we feel gains differently than losses. We are very much about trying to prevent those losses from happening in the future. The third group, the cybersecurity leadership or senior leadership in an organization, they make a lot of assumptions. They presume that users will make the rational choice at all times, even if that means the user isn't optimizing their primary goal, which, as I said, is exactly what the users are trying to do. Those leaders also make very conservative policies because their goal is the business success after all. Their very jobs sometimes depend on the company being secure, for there not being any incidents. That's bad for business. Now, all three of those groups behave in sort of a rational way from their individual perspective, but if we look at sort of an overarching perspective, it isn't totally rational in terms of the organization or the business. No one person really is maximizing their choice for the good of the organization. And what can we do about these sort of disagreeing risk models? If the user is understanding risk differently than the organizational leaders, what can be done about that? So in the same way that those three groups have different goals, they also feel loss and react to crisis quite differently. Take ransomware as one example. If you walked up to your computer tomorrow and all your files were encrypted, most users would have an immediate reaction to say, I need my data back. I'm willing to unplug the computer or pay the money, whatever will get me my data back as fast as possible, because that user feels the loss of their information very, very intensely. Users don't see the future benefit of cybersecurity. In times that aren't crisis, they just think, well, the cybersecurity is slowing down my computer. It's just getting in the way. They don't understand that it's trying to prevent future loss like ransomware. Now, again, consider the cybersecurity defenders in the case of ransomware. Their job is to put out that fire, figure out what went wrong, what broke down, how can we prevent that problem, how can we get users their data back and remedy the situation. But that's different than the user's goals. The third group, right, the CISO of a company or any other leadership in an organization, their whole job depends on security. And ransomware is a failure of that security in some sense. Some people get fired for those kinds of situations. So the CISO's real goal in life is ultimate security, even if it requires crazy amounts of resources, lots of money or time. They want zero ransomware, and they're willing sometimes to do anything to prevent that from ever happening. Now, we had users, defenders, and leaders. Let's imagine a hypothetical fourth person, which is rational Randy. This is what things would look like in a perfect world. Rational Randy would look at ransomware quite differently. And that would look like understanding the value of the data, the value of the assets, the things that might be lost, and finding security that matches the loss, not over or underspending. But that isn't really very common in our field. So to help me explain why most people don't act like Rational Randy, let me hand it over to Doug.
Thanks, Josiah. Now, what I need to do for the next couple of minutes is to give you a little tutorial on behavioral economics and cognitive biases. And I want to start with the idea of different modes of thinking. Well, philosophers for eons have talked about how we think in different ways. Aristotle did this. William James in the 19th century made a distinction between empirical thinking and associative thought. And about 12 years ago, Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, wrote this terrific book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And one of the things he talked about in that book was the two different kinds of thinking, and he described them as System 1 and System 2. Now, System 2 is what we usually think of as thinking. It's controlled, it's effortful, it's deductive, it takes some time, and you know when you're thinking. And so if someone asks you, so how did you come to that conclusion? You can say, well, I thought about this, then I thought about that, and I thought about this, and then I made this decision. System 1, on the other hand, is almost the opposite. It's quick, it's automatic, it's effortless, and if someone asks you at the end, how did you make that decision, then the answer is, well, it just seemed right. It was just right. It was intuitive, if you will. So a common example of this is thinking about when you first learned to drive a car. It was painful. It was terrifying because there was all this information coming in at you, and you had to decide what was important, what was not, what to respond to, and what not to. That is System 2. Think about how you drive a car now. I mean, you're driving and you're listening to the radio and you're talking with friends, and I hope that you're not texting, but you're using System 1. And the reason that you use System 1 is that you've driven for so long, you know how to do this, and you're basically doing it on autopilot. Now, as Kahneman points out, we have to use both System 1 and System 2. It just has to. The challenge, though, is System 2 is really expensive in terms of time and energy. It takes a lot of work. So we've got to be able to use System 1. And one of the ways we use System 1, and use it pretty effectively for the most part, is by the use of heuristics. Now let me give you a couple of definitions of heuristics. One, I'm actually going to have to read this because it's so specific. And this is from Gerd Gigerenzer, who is a psychologist at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. His definition of a heuristic is, quote, a strategy that ignores part of the information with the goal of making decisions more quickly, frugally, and/or accurately than more complex methods. One of my students described it as hunches informed by experience. And the other way to think of it is just rules of thumb that we use all the time. And one of the questions is, are heuristics good or bad? And this has been a point of debate in the field for quite some time. Gerd Gigerenzer says that, look, heuristics are great. They're fast and frugal. They save a lot of time and energy. And in most cases, close enough is good enough. It may not be perfect, but it's close enough. Well, Daniel Kahneman and his intellectual partner Amos Tversky said, and let me quote on this one, heuristics are highly economical and usually effective, but they lead to systematic and predictable errors. And the errors are that sometimes the heuristics stop you from going further. They stop you from going deeper into a particular problem. And one of the bases of these is or one of the elements of this is what they call cognitive bias. And as you can see on the slide here, there are a lot of different cognitive biases. In fact, psychologists have identified dozens and dozens of them. And let me talk about a few of them. Confirmation bias. This is when we search for and give weight to evidence that confirms what we already know. And you see this from liberals watching MSNBC and conservatives watching Fox News. We also have magical thinking as a cognitive bias, and that is we tend to think that two events that occur together are right next to each other are somehow causally related, and that as a result we create these patterns when in fact patterns may not exist. Another one is overconfidence bias, which is that we think that we can do more than we actually can. Your boss comes to you and says, Josiah, I have this project I really need to do in about 2 months. Do you think you can do it? Josiah has a lot on his plate right now, but says, no, I can do this. I'm sure that in 2 months I can do it, but 1 week before the deadline, he realizes, oh my heavens, I haven't been able to do it. I've had all these other things to do, and now I got to hurry up and do all this stuff. So that's overconfidence bias. But of course, what we really want to talk about today is action bias. And action bias is the idea, pretty simply, of don't just stand there, do something. And a couple of examples of this. One, a great example, a wonderful study that was done of elite goalkeepers in Europe and in Israel. And what they looked at was how the goalkeepers moved during penalty kicks. And if you've watched football or soccer at all, the penalty kicks are really high stakes kinds of things. And it's just the striker and the goalkeeper. When the striker hits the ball, the goalkeeper has less than a quarter of a second to save it and all that. And of course, the crowd's going crazy. And one of the things that these researchers found was that goalkeepers really only stop 1 out of 6 goals, penalty kicks. And so you really want to have the optimal strategy if you're a goalkeeper. Now, as it turns out, 95% of the time for these elite goalkeepers, they move either left or they move right. When in fact, the optimal strategy is to stay in the middle. Instead of having a 1 in 6 chance of saving a goal, they will now have a 1 in 3 chance of saving a goal. And so that's their optimal strategy. So why does 95% of the time these elite goalkeepers move either left or right? And this is a wonderful example of action bias. That, well, I've got to do something. Because think of it if you were a goalkeeper. You know that the best strategy is to stay right in the middle. But if you stay in the middle, 2/3 of the time, you're not going to be able to get the goal. To which the fans and the sports writers and your coach will go, well, why did you do that? You should have moved. You should have at least done something. Again, even though the best strategy is to stay in one spot. So what causes this action bias? Well, it's the urgency to take some action. It's to show leadership. It's to prevent second guessing, like the goalkeepers, if all they did was stand in the middle and 2/3 of the time they missed the shot. So that's action bias in general. Now, Josiah is going to talk about how action bias plays out in cybersecurity.
So the more that I have learned about action bias, the more that I have started to see it in many examples in cybersecurity. Let's go back to the ransomware example from earlier. But all of the groups I described, users and defenders and leaders, were all had this instinct to get some control over the situation, even though their actions looked differently. None of them wanted to just passively stand by and gather more information or to build on a plan that they had made early in advance. And so they went with that sort of immediate non-analysis action, and there was pressure to act, right? Ransomware often has a countdown, and if you don't take action, a bad thing happens. And so that time pressure encourages people to take any and all possible actions, particularly if they haven't encountered that situation before and haven't prepared and practiced a plan. Let me give you another example. In 2013, hackers got control of the Associated Press's Twitter account. And once they had access to the account, they sent a fake tweet that said, "There have been 2 bombings at the White House and the president is injured." Almost immediately, the stock market plummeted. And this is action bias in at least 2 ways. One, humans said, there's some catastrophe, we have to take immediate action, sell, sell, sell. We had also codified algorithms to read the news and when stuff like this happens to make automatic trades. So we built the action bias into the computer, and both of them initiated this free fall. Nobody said, let's stop and validate the claims, let's get more information and make sure it's true before we act. It just happened. The action just kicked in almost immediately. The third example, and maybe the one that came to mind for you first, is phishing. Phishing actually plays on this fear that you need to take some urgent action right away. Your account is compromised, money has been lost. And the reason that phishing works is because people have this intuitive action to act without thinking beforehand. Now, even well-educated professionals, you and me, are also subject to this bias. And having some awareness is certainly the first step in doing better preparation, but none of us are immune from it. Let me give a last and fourth example, which is incident response. In some companies, if the organization has a breach or a compromise, they hire an external incident response team. The goal there is literally for that response team to take some action. But let me tell you why this is different. Those are well-educated, prepared, trained experts who know when the action will have positive benefit and when an action actually won't have any benefit. That's quite different than most average people reacting to a crisis. The incident response team, yes, is being paid to take action, but they are prepared and adequately making the right decisions there. So there are catastrophic cyber incidences, it seems like every day, every week. And there's a pressure to act and to prevent those occurrences from happening again. But the more that we just live in the seat of the moment without that preparation, the more inconsistent our actions are, and sometimes the actions we take end up making the situation worse. At this point, you might be saying, are they just telling us to let bad things happen? Let me assure you that is not what I mean whatsoever. There are plenty of situations where we as firefighters need to triage and put out the fire first thing. That is the most important to do. That being said, a fire is a well understood situation, and a firefighter knows the correct actions to take in that situation. The trouble is, if we haven't prepared, or if we end up in a new interesting situation that we didn't prepare for, we might end up jumping to the wrong or even a contradictory decision in the end. So it's difficult for most of us to distinguish between the benefits of an action and the risks of an action, particularly when we are under this pressure to act in the middle of a crisis. So once the fire is under control, once we have it triaged, what comes next? In my view, 2 of the most dangerous words in all of cybersecurity are the phrase, "never again." I hear this a lot in my life, and I think that lots of us hear it from politicians and business leaders, even our friends and family, which is, man, that crisis was difficult. We can never live through that again. We can never let that happen again. Let me give you 3 reasons why I think this is so dangerous. First, it encourages people to try anything and everything to stop it from ever happening again. that is a real recipe for wasteful and wrongful spending our resources to try and remedy a problem so that it never happens again. It sets the wrong goal. Two, it actually makes an incorrect presumption, which is we can achieve this goal. We can stop hackers. We can stop attackers from ever trying again, when in fact, the attackers are motivated to keep attacking. Nothing that we can do will ever be 100% successful, and never again sets this unprecedented goal that we can be 100% successful, when in fact, the attackers are going to keep attacking. And it sets a really negative situation for at least for those of us in cybersecurity. Number three, risk management done well and done appropriately would help put this phrase into much better context. If we understood how much our assets are worth, and we devote the appropriate amount of preparation and appropriate amount of security, we're not living in a world of never again, but we're lowering risk, minimizing risk as much as possible, without spending all of the corporation's resources to try and get it to zero. We'll never get to zero risk. We can also never win if we set the goal to never again. If we tell our workforce there can never be another data breach, that's very much a frustrating goal for most of us in cybersecurity. It leads to more stress than it's worth. We need to think about different metrics, different ways of measuring success that are realistic and help achieve the goals that really matter. So let me describe some countermeasures by starting with what not to do. In the middle of a crisis, the best reaction is almost never to pull the plug. It's almost never to pull the system off the internet. There are better, smarter things we can do, and it's not just about better programming. In the Twitter hack example, we had codified action bias into the programs. So we can't just program our way out of this problem. It's really about thinking differently and being prepared. So what can you do? Good risk assessment is the best place to start. And many of us have a risk management program. Sometimes they are successful. Many times they are done one time a year or one time ever, but we don't actually put the risk management into day-to-day practice. But done well, that should reduce the amount of action bias that occurs because we've done preparation. We've thought ahead about the problem. Number two is training and awareness. I must tell you that this is a big culture change. It isn't something we can just solve overnight. But telling your workforce that action bias is a human condition gives them some opportunity to think more carefully now and in the crisis about what to do. But we have to change those user reactions over time. Every opportunity that comes up, we should remind people, let's be cautious. Let's remember not to just jump into action without thinking. So having that conversation now in times of calm, when there's not a crisis, that helps prepare them for the time when they need it. Just as Doug talked about driving. In the beginning, when you were taking driver's ed, it's a very stressful scenario, and over our accumulated experience, we come to have the right heuristics that enable us to drive safely, but that takes a lot of time and practice. Number three, we need to educate senior leadership. They need to know that we're not always going to jump to the side of the goal during the penalty kick. Sometimes we're going to stand still, deliberate waiting, and that's a deliberate, reasonable choice. Some leaders would look at that and say, like the fans in the soccer game, well, why didn't they do anything? When in fact, that is a deliberate action sometimes. But we need to help our leadership understand that is an option, it's on the table, and sometimes it is the best decision that we can take. The biggest one I want to emphasize for you is slow down. And by slow down, I don't necessarily mean when there's a fire, just move very slowly to put out the fire. Actually, what I mean is shift the time, shift all of your thinking to before the crisis, so that in the moment you are prepared and you have practiced and you're ready for that. I also think it's important to have some healthy skepticism in the heat of the moment. If somebody says, you know what, we should do some action in response to this data breach, have some healthy skepticism. Ask yourself, is that going to have the benefits that I think it's going to, and at what costs? It's always good to have and develop that healthy skepticism. You know the phrase in shooting, ready, aim, fire? It feels like in cybersecurity too often we fire first, and then maybe it's ready, and then maybe it's aim. We can recall those phrases in the heat of the moment to say, are we ready first before we take whatever the analogy for shooting is? And again, watchful waiting is a slowing down. In the heat of the moment, many soccer players, many sports players will say, the game seemed to move in slow motion. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, they've practiced. They can see the game moving out in their head as if it were in slow motion because they are prepared. And in cybersecurity, we can do the same thing. In the heat of a crisis, it might seem like things are moving in slow motion and we can make very good choices because we've done that preparation. We've moved all the time devoted to the problem before it actually happens. It was Eisenhower who had a quote that was along the lines of, plans are useless, but planning is everything. Even the plans that we make might not be perfect. But if we just have SOPs or playbooks on the shelf and we never even look at them, that's not very helpful. We need to practice them. But we also need to understand that the preparation process is at least as valuable as the book on the shelf. Knowing who should be in the room to make a decision, where is the data we might need to make a better decision, whatever the situation is, even if it's one we never anticipated, we can still benefit from the preparation process. So it's very, very important to do more planning, to practice plans, but to be prepared for the unexpected. So having spent some of my life as a researcher and having a passion for cybersecurity science, I think this is not a solved problem. And I would throw out a couple of research ideas for any of you looking for topics, because there's much, much more we can do. One is, how could we allow people to validate threats? So when the weird tweet comes out and it seems unexpected, instead of taking action bias, instead of just gut instinct response, how could we get more information quickly and more trustworthy? Whether that's emails that come in your inbox or things that we see online, how can we fact check those threats? Maybe it's, hey Siri, is this a legitimate email? Or something along those lines. Number two is, how do we normalize the deep thought, the system two thinking versus the reflexive system one thinking? Again, I don't know all the ways to build this into a computer. I've heard some interesting ones recently, one of which was deliberate friction. In an important situation or in a situation where the user has to make a choice about, do I proceed to the website? Do I click the button? Could the computer actually make it a little bit more difficult on purpose to enforce the user, to get the user to think more carefully about, oh, do I really want to do that? Make it a little less easy just to click the bad link. The last one is about mental models. And there's actually lots of researchers in the usability community thinking about, how does our brain internalize what's happening on the computer? That's what a mental model is. And how can we help understand what is the user thinking when they make this very quick action bias decision? And how can we change their mental model to allow them to do that deeper thinking and then build that in as a routine? So the mental model sticks with us in all kinds of situations. How can we evolve those to help combat action bias? Many of you, I'm sure, remember the flight in 2009 when Sully Sullenberger had an airplane where the birds took out both engines of the airplane, and relatively quickly he made a decision to land that plane in the Hudson and saved all 155 passengers on board. He was criticized for a while that he took too long to decide, that he didn't just take the immediate action and do what the playbook said, but instead, based on his years of experience, particularly in understanding risk, he knew that a delay was better than a disaster, and that thinking saved 155 people's lives. Action bias is our built-in sense to gain control by taking some action, and never again is the extreme of that kind of action bias. What I hope you remember from this presentation is, slow down, move the time that you devote to a problem before the crisis occurs, have a plan, practice the plan, and be prepared for the unexpected, because we can't anticipate everything that's going to happen, particularly in cybersecurity. So what can you do? Right away, this afternoon, when you go back to work, start spreading the word about action bias. Let people know that this is a real human condition. It's not a weakness, it's not something we fire people for, but we need to raise awareness that this is how the human brain sometimes responds, and we can do it differently. We can overcome these problems. In the next 3 months, in a little bit longer term, look at the books on your shelf. Look at the SOPs you have, the playbooks, the plans. Make sure they're up to date for whatever they're built for. And if needed, update them, make sure they're up to date. And also think about what other goals and metrics could you set for the organization that will balance both security and usability. Whatever the goals are of the organization, make sure we're not devoting too few or too many resources to cybersecurity. In the long term, let's say in the next 6 months or so, run an exercise. Do a tabletop exercise or a red team. Actually try out those plans. Don't just let them get dusty on the shelf. It's developing the habits, developing the routines of doing it. The same way we have fire drills to make sure that everybody understands where to go, and in the heat of a crisis, we're not having to figure out what do we do here and ending up making poor decisions. Again, keep working on culture change. It takes a long time. It might feel frustrating that we continue to have these gut instinct reactions, but the more that we work, the more that we talk, the more that we think about slow, deliberate processing, the better it will become in the long run. Humans are central to cybersecurity. We need each and every one of you, and we need to help the people be as good as they can. That's what this is all about. We are not immune. Nobody is immune just having heard this presentation, but at least you're aware. And that is really the first step. Preparation and practice, those are key, can lead to both consistent and more rational actions. We hope that you put these into practice, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with the community, and we look forward to your questions and ideas.